Well, Football Manager 26 is off to a pretty rocky start. The in-match graphics look absolutely stunning. I really like these. But the user interface has some problems. Things as simple as creating and saving a training schedule seem to be really buggy, and there are really problems all over the place. And so, as you know, the community has been pretty negative. But there are still reasons for optimism for this game. So the thing that you might not realize is that Football Manager 26 was created on Unity. And Unity, by its very nature, means that there are going to be more options for modifying things than there ever were before. But let me slow down a little bit and explain. In FM24, the directory structure was filled with these FMF files. There are tons of these FMF files out there, and they contain a lot of the information that governs how the game really works. Now, Sports Interactive has been very kind over the years by providing us with this resource archiver. This program allows us to extract and recompile the FMF files for modding purposes. So, for example, the simatch.fmf file contains all of these files that inform how the physics and ratings of the game work. This physicalconstraints.jsb file became pretty famous a few months ago when people realized that they could change the match engine itself by tinkering with it. You can also mess around a little bit with match sounds. And other files contain things like all of the player and press interactions in the game, all of which can be modified. Now, not everything can be easily changed, but you can change a lot in FM24 and presumably also in earlier versions of Football Manager, though people haven't really tried it. And there are FMF files in FM26, which has led some people to conclude that nothing has really changed under the hood, but that's not entirely accurate. As you can see, the directory structure of FM26 is different than it was in FM24. Now, the old FMF files, at least some of them, are in this shared folder. If you look inside its data subdirectory, you will see some familiar names. I used the FM24 resource archiver to extract simatch.fmf to look around, and I saw some things that look somewhat familiar. However, there are some things that are missing. For example, that physical constraints file that could be modified to change the match engine around a little bit. The other thing that's missing is simatchviewerpc.fmf, which is the file that held all of the game's sound files. Now, those files were in WAV format, and the fact that the simatchviewerpc file is no longer there tells me that there actually have been changes to the sound structure of the game. But don't panic. What we're running into is the fact that things have simply changed. While FM26 does make use of some of the Unity files for things like the training system and the media system, press conferences, stuff like that, the bulk of the game has been converted over to Unity. Let me show you what that means. Okay, let's take a look at that Football Manager 26 folder again. As you know, the game itself is this exe file, which is a Windows executable file. And if you're running Linux, like I am, Arch by the way, you need to make sure you're running Proton to get it to run. Now, this D3D12 folder is how Unity uses DirectX 12. We won't worry about that for now. This data folder includes a bunch of other FMF files. This is where your media file is, your training files, and a bunch of other stuff that might be fun to get into and explore. But honestly, I'm not convinced that we're going to keep seeing those FMF files in the future, and I'll show you why I think things are going to change. In Unity games, the asset files tend to be in data folders like this one, FM Data. This looks a lot different from the sort of files that we're used to seeing in Football Manager games. Now, as I understand it, these .asset files include the raw assets that the game uses. And believe it or not, there are some pretty easy to find tools that allow you to inspect what those asset files contain and theoretically to modify them. But the actual resources that the game uses seems to be in a different folder. Okay, go over to the Streaming Assets folder, then go to the AA folder. You should then see a folder called Standalone Windows 64. Within that folder are almost 300 files that seem to contain all the visual assets used by the game, including the user interface, the 3D match engine, and so on. Now, I'm not an experienced modder. I don't have a lot of experience with some of the tools that you can find through a quick Google search that will help you get into like those bundle files and check things out. However, I do know that there are things that can be done because they've been done in other games that were created in Unity in the past. And yeah, when you think about it, you'll realize that this means it is possible that we might be able to change more Football Manager than we ever dreamed of. Now, if you go back to that FM data folder, you'll notice this IL2CPP data folder right here. There really isn't anything useful inside and there's no reason to change it. However, this is a pretty strong clue that Football Manager 26 uses IL2CPP instead of mono to compile the game. This is important to know if you're interested in potentially modifying the game. Based on what I've read, it seems that this game assembly DLL file contains the information you might be looking for if you want to get into the inner workings of the game. This is why there is no assembly C# DLL file like you'll find mentioned in most guides to modding Unity games. Now, based on what I've read about it, IL2CPP creates a couple of challenges when it comes to modifying the games that use it. But to understand what those challenges are, you have to understand what the program does, how it works. There are two ways that Unity converts C# script into native programming languages. One is using something called Mono, and another is using IL2CPP. IL2CPP literally stands for Intermediate Language to C++. It's used to convert what we call intermediate language code, for example C#, into C++. It then takes the C++ code and converts it into a native binary file which the target computer can then run. Now, it's pretty well known that using IL2CPP will make it difficult for modders to decompile Unity games back to the source code. But there are still ways to do it. Now, I'm not going to show you what those tools are and what the people use. Just know that there are still ways to decompile and to modify things, just like how those who want to modify things in games like Football Manager 2024 are not necessarily just trying to copy like important game code for their own purposes, right? There are ways you can get in, you can make a couple of changes to some settings and sort of see what happens. Anyway, all of that brings me to the pregame editor. Traditionally, the pregame editor has only been a database editing tool. Now, if you go way back to the directory structure of games like Championship Manager 0304, you'll see something interesting. My understanding is that database updates back then involved editing the client db.dat file. Now, it was possible to edit the database, yeah, but it must have been a real pain to do so. My understanding is that the pregame editor started out way back in Football Manager 2005 as an easier way to allow players to make the database edits that they wanted to make. As you can see in this blurry image, it was basically a stripped down version of what we have today, but it looks quite familiar. And it came with this guidelines PDF file, an official manual that we haven't seen for the pregame editor in years. But like I said, from the beginning, the whole conception behind it was limited only to changing the player database. Now, the thing that's exciting about Unity is that you could theoretically look at a more expanded editor, one that not only could change things in the database, but could allow for a greater variety of modding. And yeah, I'm talking about the Football Manager modding scene looking a lot more like what you see for Paradox games, for example. If I were to give Sports Interactive any advice, it would be to look to popular games like Cities Skylines for inspiration. One of the reasons why that game has stood the test of time is because Paradox gave it an adapted Unity engine with official modding support. Of course, more recent Paradox games use the company's proprietary programming engine, but the modding support is still there. In other words, I can see a future potentially in which people interested in Football Manager modding no longer will need to use hex editors to guess at variables in some obscure file somewhere. So for me, if I could be given like anything that I want beyond just, a functional beta for the game, which is another problem, what I'd really like to see is an expanded editor for Football Manager that allows you not only to change the database and the skin, but also a lot of the other assets and ways that the game runs. I'm thinking about changing things like the sounds, the visuals, the press conference scripts, or even more complex things like how the morale system works and some of the internal weights that the game uses. In my my opinion, it would be much better for Sports Interactive to come out with an official tool to allow us to modify this stuff than letting the modding community figure out how to do it with a bunch of trial and error with the source code of the game itself. Or in other words, if you're Sports Interactive and you want to maintain control over what can and cannot be changed, give us the freedom to modify more of the game than we ever could before, and to do it easily without messing around with a bunch of other products and applications.